Our elites tell us the science is settled. The planet is getting hotter. Well, I don't know about the science, but history is telling us something very different. In fact, it's saying the opposite. The planet is cooling. And that means one thing. Buckle up. Now, I'll confess that back in 2006, I think it was, I watched that Al Gore movie, which was telling us all that the world was going to end within, what was it, 5, 10, whatever years back then. I watched the film, I went to the cinema, I came out totally convinced. I guess I was still a bit of a normie back then. Since then, though, I kept my eyes open and I kept my mind open. And it's become apparent, especially the last couple of years, there's no warming happening around the planet. We were having warming, it seems, up until around the point, maybe about a decade ago, 5 to 10 years ago, but it's not happening anymore. And we all know that the elites who push this down our throats, the celebrities, the politicians, the usual people who are owned by the usual suspects, those people are total hypocrites. Their lifestyles are high consumption of fossil fuels sorts of lifestyles. They've made no changes to lessen their impact on the planet. And if any of them really believed that sea levels were going to rise and drown us all, they wouldn't be scooping up all those waterfront mansions. The most expensive real estate in Australia is next to Sydney Harbour, and it's owned by those same elites who tell us that the planet's going to get hotter, the polar ice caps are going to melt, and we're all going to drown unless we accept the Great Reset agenda. So, we all know that that's a lie. And it's a lie which is coming from those same elites who gather at Davos every year. The ones who many people suspect are behind a lot of the inconveniences to our everyday life that we've been experiencing the last couple of years, let's say. Well, Al Gore was at Davos this year, and he had a fit of hyperventilation about how, get this, global warming is causing 600,000 Hiroshima bombs on Earth every day. That's what he said. He did his "how dare you" Greta moment, and the line that he pulled out is that the planet every day is having 600,000 Hiroshima bombs dropped on it. Now, obviously, Al thinks we're retarded. And you can know that because you'd have to be totally retarded to possibly believe that something like that could be occurring. It's just so dumb. It's just so ridiculous. And we know, though, half the population will totally believe it. What can we do about that? Now, evil people project. If you've ever done a bit of reading on narcissism, that type of thing, the people who abuse others, they tend to project their wickednesses onto others. So, obviously, Al Gore and the other elites who like to push us all around, they speak to us in a way that reveals that they think we're really stupid to the point of being totally retarded. Now, that worries me because these are the people in charge. And obviously, if they're projecting, that means they're retarded. We should all be concerned about that. So, every summer in Australia for years and years, we've been told that the heat wave that we were experiencing was a sign that global warming is accelerating, it's a catastrophe, blah, blah, blah. And it was always the extreme weather in summer which was used for the global warming narrative. Now, the same principles didn't apply in winter, and over the last couple of winters, we've been having record cold weather all across the country. And no matter how much they fudge the data, they like to put the temperature recording machines in places which are kind of heat sinks, like airports and stuff like that. They do all these sort of shenanigans to try and convince the normies that it really is warming up. But it's been getting colder clearly in Australia. And every winter when we've been having record cold weather, we don't get the opposite narrative that, hey, look, the planet is cooling for some reason. Of course, we know why. Now, it's getting to the point, though, where it's impossible for the elites to ignore this pattern. For example, the coldest temperature ever recorded in the United States of America was recorded in February 2023. You can check it out for yourself. It was minus 78 degrees Celsius at Mount Washington. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit because I don't understand Fahrenheit. But it's really, really cold. And across North America, records have again been shattered in 2023, cold records. And these record cold temperatures, they were often only broken 2 or 3 years before. It's very, very clear. The cooling that the planet is experiencing is intensifying, and it's global because the same thing's happening in Asia. In fact, the World Economic Forum even wrote about this, that all-time cold records have been broken in Asia. And this is used in a very pernicious and totally narcissistic way to gaslight the public by saying that, well, yes, record cold is occurring in Asia, and this is happening at the same time as record heat, and so what we're experiencing is extremes because climate change. Unfortunately, the low info normies are going to eat that up. They're going to believe it. But we know, people who've kept our two brain cells alive and not let them be suffocated by masks, we know that the trend is not towards warming. It's very, very clear. The science is totally wrong. It's getting colder. Now, I can't make an argument from science because I'm not a scientist, and I find when you engage with normies, with that boomer relative that you had to go to the curry restaurant with, the ones who just won't accept that anything that the TV tells them could be wrong. When you try and engage with those people about sort of the science, you don't get anywhere. So I would like to engage with the history. And I'm going to go through in this video, and I'm going to go through the sequence of climatic history on Earth, starting at zero. I'm going to start back at the time of Christ, during the Roman Empire. And I'm going to go through over the last 2,000 years, and we're going to look at how clearly obvious it is that there is a natural climate cycle. And then we're going to see that very, very clearly you want to be around when the planet is warming. But if you want a hard times make strong men type of experience in your lifetime, you're going to come down when it's getting colder. And that's what we're going to be living through for the rest of our lives. All right, so let's go. I'm going to go through these natural cycles of warming and cooling and how this clearly links to the cycle of the rise and fall of civilizations. Let me know in the comments if you still don't agree that this is the case by the end of the video, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. So let's start at zero. From 0 to about 500 AD, this is known as the Roman warm period. Not a conspiracy theory, it's on Wikipedia. This was the warmest period in Europe for the last 2,000 years. In fact, in Europe, it was on average about 2 degrees warmer Celsius again, than it is today. That doesn't sound like much, but it makes a big difference for agriculture and for human flourishing. Now, during this time, this is when we see an era that historians have largely agreed was one of the most prosperous and peaceful periods in East Asia and in Europe to have been alive. If you were alive in the 2nd century AD, even the first half of the 3rd century AD, you were living in it was like the post-war boom that we saw in the West after World War II, right? These were the good times, and it went for a long time. The Roman warm period was when we saw enormous aqueducts being built, the expansion of massive cities. In China, they had cities which were larger than any cities in Europe before the Victorian English cities of the 19th century. Like this was a period of peak human civilization. And that's important because then in the 6th century AD, so that's the 500s, things went pear-shaped. This is known as the crisis of the 6th century. Again, not a conspiracy theory, it's on Wikipedia. The cities of the Western Roman Empire basically disappeared during the 500s. Wars, famines, barbarians, all of that. So at the end of the 6th century AD, the big cities of the Western Roman Empire were gone. And although the Eastern Roman Empire sort of limped along, it began an 800-year-long decline. And so what happened, starting at around about 500, was there was a downturn in agricultural production, and this then fed into an increased economic pressure on the system. Now, the government spending was fixed, and so the liabilities that the state had to fund wars, for all of those sorts of social welfare programs the Romans were well known for, that was fixed. And so when the tax take declined, this led to an increased squeezing of the population by the government. And interestingly enough, this also happened when wars against Persia were peaking. So we saw large-scale wars. First thing that happens, downturn in the climate, global cooling. This happens at a time when wars are increasing. Interestingly enough, there's also an increase in large-scale building, which is another part of this pattern, but I won't go into it in this video. We might talk about that in another video. We see famine, we see pestilence, and we see riots. Now, the increased taxes that were put on the people to maintain the state led eventually to riots in 532 in Constantinople, known as the Nika riots. These were some of the deadliest riots in all of Roman history, and eventually the emperor, under the advice of his wife, only survived the riots by bringing in soldiers from a foreign part of the empire to kill the people inside the city who were rioting. So we see huge disturbances and because of this increased economic pressure. Now, it wasn't just economics though, because fascinatingly enough, 536 AD, only 4 years after those Nika riots, during that year, there was a volcanic winter across the entire Earth. Historians consider 536 actually to be just about the worst time in all of history to have been alive. And what happened in 536 was there was a volcano, probably a volcano in Iceland, which went off, and it was big enough to darken the sky around the world for years. Sources in East Asia even mention it. The Chinese analysts made records of this dimming of the light that came from the sun. The Roman authors said that even at noon, people didn't have a shadow because the light was so dim. This had a catastrophic effect on agriculture, and indeed increased volcanic eruptions up to 547 AD compounded the problem. This led to a total catastrophe there in the the Roman world. The drop in temperatures then also fed into the conditions for a plague. Yes, on top of everything that was suddenly going wrong in the Roman world, there was a pandemic, not a fake one, a real one. It's known as the Plague of Justinian. It was in 541 AD, only 5 years after the volcanic winter that I mentioned. And that plague, which was probably the first instance of bubonic plague occurring in Europe, it came in waves for the next 200 years. It killed about half the population in the Roman world. All of this happened within a decade. And all of it was caused by a drop in temperatures. You don't want to be around when you're entering global cooling. Things go haywire. Now, the cool period lasted for about 200 years or so. And it ended in the early 800s. And interestingly enough, and we might talk about this in subsequent videos or go into a bit more detail about this because I don't want this to get too long. But in the 800s, we see a flourishing again of human civilization. There's a period of expansion. This is the time of the Scandinavian expansion when the Vikings sort of decided to go and sail across the seas and get themselves some Gaelic maidens. You know, this period which led to increased economic growth led into the sort of high Middle Ages that you think of with chivalry and jousting and big castles and the enormous cathedrals being built. This led into the high Middle Ages of the 1200s. Interestingly enough, a period when the Lincoln Cathedral was constructed in England, which was the largest building to have been constructed since the Great Pyramid thousands of years before. That's the high Middle Ages. It peaked in the 1200s. And then you get this medieval warm period. It's known as, again, not a conspiracy theory, it's on Wikipedia, the medieval warm period. And it ended in the 1300s. Exactly like happened in the 6th century. You got the crisis of the late Middle Ages. Again, not a conspiracy theory. Listen to what went wrong in the 1300s. You had the Great Famine of 1315. Killed, I think, about a third of the population. You had the start of the 100 Years' War between England and France in 1337. You had the Black Death arrive in 1347. There was an event known as the Great Schism of 1378 when the Catholic Church almost ripped itself apart. And then in 1381 there was the Great Peasant Revolt, which was the largest peasant revolt in English history. All of it within a very short amount of time. And all of it when we can see recorded temperatures dropped across the planet. Now, this is known as the Little Ice Age. It again went for a couple of hundred years, and the transition into it was catastrophic. After this Little Ice Age, we have what we've been living in our lifetimes, the modern warm period. It began in the mid-1800s. And it's no accident that when the planet started to warm up again after the mid-1800s, we had the rise of industrial civilization. This is modernity. This miraculous material utopia that we've been living in all our lives and that we take for granted is totally reliant upon this modern warm period. And we've got some bad news, because warmth means expansion, flourishing, wealth, and generally peace. A transition into cooling means war, famine, lots of problems, ultimately collapse. And the problem for us is we've entered a clear global cooling phase. It started a couple of years ago and it's obvious everywhere. And the clear trend towards cooling that we're seeing in the world right now means one thing. The hard times that we think we've been going through the last couple of years, they haven't even started.